announcement on the phone. Welcome to the CINFWebinar series. For those of you that may not be familiar, CINF is the ACS Division of Chemical Information. And we started these webinars after our national meeting last fall, and this is the third one in the series. By way of introduction, the programming committee does quite a good job at setting up symposia at our national meetings, but we recognize that there's, first of all, a lot of people that aren't able to make it to the national meetings, and even if you are there, you can't make it to all the sessions we have. So this webinar series was an attempt to meet the needs of our members and people beyond our community to bring some of that quality programming to venues other than the national meeting. So we appreciate your feedback on this. There's an email address on there on the screen, chair@acscinf.org, to provide your feedback and also suggestions for future webinars. A couple things about the webinar platform. ACS Publications is providing this platform for today's meeting, and there is a chat box on the left-hand side of the display. So if you have technical problems or if you have questions that you want to ask later on, feel free to type something into that chat box, and our host here will see that and try to fix any problems that we have. And this was just a reminder, we already are recording, so that's good. So I'd like to welcome Jason Priem from the University of North Carolina, who agreed to join us today and make this presentation. His title is Telling a Fuller Story of Research Impact with Altmetrics and ImpactStory. Jason is a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in Information and Library Science. He's very interested in the scholarly publishing environment, ecosystem, and the processes around that, and very much interested in the ways in which technology is having an impact on that these days. He has received a lot of attention in recent months, and so we're grateful to him for taking time out from his schedule to speak with us. And so Jason, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to hearing your remarks. And I think we'll probably hold questions till the end, and then we'll have a Q&A time after Jason makes his presentation.
Much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Terrific. So I think we have an hour all told, yeah?
Yep.
Great. So I'll talk for like maybe 45 minutes or something like that, maybe a little less, and then we'll give us plenty of chance to chat because I'm really excited to hear from y'all as well. So thanks very much for the introduction. Excellent. And so thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to y'all. I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and we'll see if that actually works. Can you see it?
Not quite yet.
All right.
Oh, maybe. No, maybe we do. Maybe you're still seeing my screen on your screen. Right. There we go. There we go. There we go. Yeah.
All right. There we go. All right. So apologies for the wrong title slide. That was from an earlier presentation I got a little confused about. Yes, I don't really need to introduce myself after that introduction, so we'll just get straight into the slides. So I kind of like taking a bit of a historical perspective from my background in history. So I like to look, the current scholarly communication system we have right now, how to start, right? So in the very beginning, it was all based on the letter, the traditional sort of, what they called the Republic of Science, which was all these various, at the time they're called gentlemen of science rather than scientists, because they're all dudes. And they were sending each other letters all the time and sharing the interesting things that they had found. Of course, this is slow and expensive, and there's a tremendous amount of duplication in this system, but it was the best solution given the available technology. However, once the printing press becomes popular, all of a sudden there's a lot more options. So in 1665, we have the first sort of big revolution in scientific communication, and that's when Henry Oldenburg published the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. So his idea was, let's take the best available technology that we have today, the printing press, and let's really change dissemination. Oldenburg looked at the Royal Society, saw all these people sending letters, and he said, look, y'all, why don't you guys just send, I'm sure he said it just like that, right? Look, y'all. He said, why don't y'all send your letters to me? I'll bind them together, we'll put them all in one place, and that way we eliminate a lot of this expense and cost, and we greatly speed the pace, accelerate the pace of innovation in sciences. And so these first issues of Field Trends are really cool. If you get a chance to go back there and read them and stuff, they're like, they'll have articles like, I was driving along the country one day and I spied an interesting way to stack haystacks in a field. And so I went to the farmer and I asked him, why is it that you stack your hay in this manner? And he told me that sheds rain differently or whatever. And that's a real article, right? I mean, that was the kind of stuff they were doing because they had this terrific idea that, oh man, this observation, gives us all these wonderful secrets to the world. This new way of thinking, this enlightened way of thinking, reveals all these really cool truths about the world. Of course, science communication rapidly progressed a bit beyond the sort of ad hoc or cowboy approach to something a lot more formalized and a lot more homogeneous. And I'd argue that that's because the First Revolution promoted this homogeneity of outputs because it was industrial-style production, right? The printing press is a factory, right? The factory for creating pieces of paper with a particular set of ink on them. And if you want to build things in a factory, you quickly want standardization. And so we moved increasingly towards the sort of standardization of the article format. Sort of same length, same sort of sections, same tone, same type of content. And then there are advantages to that, both for producers and for readers. But there are some disadvantages in the same way that, we sort of moved towards, a lot of people decry the move towards corn monoculture in the U.S., in the Midwest United States. We have a similar situation with articles right now. We have an article monoculture. And I'm suggesting that we're on the brink of a second revolution, and that this second revolution is going to promote a diversity of outputs rather than a homogeneity of outputs. And the reason is because publication is nearly free, right? It's very easy to publish, and to capture the parts of the scholarly record that we used to be missing. What do I mean by the parts of the scholarly record used to be missing? Well, particularly I'm talking about instead of moving paper products faster, which is essentially what we use the web for today, right? You pull up a PDF on your computer screen, that might as well be on paper. We just delivered it with faster horses. We haven't fundamentally changed the system, right? But instead, we can start creating web-native science, right? Scholarly communication products that are board on the web and that actually use the potential of the web. So when I talk about areas of scholarly communication that we're missing, I have 4 particular things in mind, sort of going through the steps of what we do when we create science. We start with data, right? So everything kind of starts with scientific data, and traditionally that data wasn't published because, there are a couple of exceptions, but because it would have been just reams and reams of paper, right? Well, today we can start thinking about data as a scholarly product in its own right, and increasingly people are. So instead of taking a bunch of live notebooks and cramming them in a drawer somewhere, instead we can actually start putting data online. So there are great places like Dryad or Figshare where you can take your data sets in CSV or Excel or more arcane formats, whatever you have, upload them to the web and let other people build off of that data. Of course, in some kinds of science, the data collection is the really difficult bit, and then later on you can sort of do these analyses that are much easier, although they, of course, are extremely important. What if we didn't have to collect that data 10, 20, 30 times? What if we could build off of it one time and then spend all of the extra time doing really interesting analyses and combining data sets together and doing meta-analyses, things like that? So web-native scholarship is in part, like I said, publishing data as a product. The next step, once we have data, we can then move up to analysis, right? And so in a lot of areas of science, analysis has traditionally, could probably be summarized as a graduate student clicking things on SPSS until something said 0.05, right? To be a little uncharitable. Increasingly, though, we can do analyses that are a lot more mature, that are scripted. So we can use things like the R computer language. R is an open source statistical environment where we can actually, every statistical transformation that we do, right, it just sort of, it gets its own little line in the script. And if you wanted to rerun someone's analysis, especially, if you've got their data and you've got the R script, you just click go, and it'll just churn through there and just do every single bit of the analysis that they did, create all of their figures again and everything else, which is great in terms of reproducibility because you can sort of see, make sure that, what bits of their analysis were correct and maybe a little bit suspect. But it's also terrific if, you've got a different data set and you want to run it through the exact same analysis. Or conversely, you take someone's data and say, well, I think your analysis is a little flawed, or maybe it could be expanded on a little bit. Here's my version of analysis, right? And then you can actually publish that analysis. People can look through there and run that for themselves. So I think that's a really exciting sort of web-native product as well. So we've got the data, we've got analysis. Where do we go from there? Well, the next step is we have to tell a story, right? Otherwise it's just numbers. It's not interesting, right? Science is grounded by theory, and essentially it's grounded by narrative. In a way, we still tell the same sort of haystack stories, but in a little bit, more mature or formalized way. The story, right, involves a protagonist, there's a researcher, and there's an antagonist, sort of, an irritating problem in the field that hasn't been solved. And by the end of the story, hopefully we found that the protagonist has triumphed over the antagonist, and now we know a little bit more about the world. So we've always told those stories in articles, right? And an article, I think, is essentially a story about science. But we've only had one format in which to tell those stories. Imagine if every single fiction product in the world was a 250-page novel, right? We'd be missing out on a lot of potential stories. There's short stories, we've got novellas, we've got multi-volume works, plays, we've got all different ways to represent a story. And so I think increasingly we're going to see the same thing for scholarship. Instead of just this sort of dead and static paper, we're going to see interactive stories, we're going to see visual stories, we're going to see shorter stories, so like a blog post or even a tweet describing someone's research. So we can sort of begin to tell this sort of diverse set of stories. And then finally, the conversation is at the top of this graph, but I think it's really at the root of everything, right? Because once there's the data and the analysis and finally someone tells a story, then you go back and start talking about it, right? You talk about it with your colleagues over email, talk about it with your colleagues at a conference, talk about it with your colleagues in a discussion group, over lunch, right, informally. Just sort of discussing, the kinds of things you're reading, and a lot of times we say, oh, this is rubbish, but there's a little good bit in there, or this is amazing, and there's a bad bit in there, or so-so, right? We have these conversations, and in many ways, this lies at the root of everything we do in science, right? It's in these conversations, these discussions, and these sort of informal considerations that all of the other stuff comes out of. So what's the web do for that? Well, increasingly, these conversations are happening online. There was a time when they were entirely ephemeral. They were just sort of, in the same way that, a word gets uttered and just drifts off in the ether. Nowadays, maybe that conversation is happening on Twitter or it's happening on a blog. And so even the conversations themselves become scholarly products that are fixed in cyberspace. So one of the great things about web-native science is we can actually start making public rather than just publishing, right? And so a lot of times in science, well, is it published, right? And we said it's like big P published, right? Is it published? Very serious. But of course, the root of publishing is just making public, right? And in some ways, I think we've lost that a bit as we've focused so much on this idea of publishing. We're forgetting to make things public. And the great thing about web-native science is all of these products are ways of making public the science that we're doing, even though they may not fit into the big P sort of publishing description. Of course, the problem then, I think a lot of us would think of is, well, gosh, Jay, if we're publishing all of these things, we're making everything public, right? We've got these blog posts and data sets and analyses and conversations. Good heavens, I can't even keep track of the articles that I'm supposed to read right now. Right? How are we supposed to, we're talking about a 10-fold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold increase. How are we going to filter this? My suggestion is we need to think differently about information overflow. We need to think less about turning off the taps, right? Oh, we need less information, and more about building boats. We need to think about how can we use all of this information in different ways. How can we keep our head above water a little bit better? So here's just kind of an example of how I do that in my sort of professional life. Is a big part of the way I handle my filtering is with Twitter. So I follow a bunch of people on Twitter, and typically I find those people are adding value to my life. I love on the left-hand column here there's a cat picture, so that basically summarizes what Twitter is all about. But there's actually quite a lot of professional stuff here. So you see the middle column is Altmetrics. So this is my field, it's what I study, and if there's interesting developments in Altmetrics, they happen in that middle column much, much, much faster than they would happen in a journal. Moreover, I don't have to read, let's say, the Journal of Information Science and Technology every month when it comes out. Most of the stuff in there is, it's interesting, but it's not my field, and it's kind of, it's sort of, for me, it's noise, right? I mean, it's not focused on what I do. Whereas here, I can focus with laser beam precision on exactly my subfield. And if there are people that, whose tweets are not adding value to me, then they're out, right? I follow people all the time. And if there are new people, I follow them all the time, right? So Twitter is, a pretty coarse way of doing this, because, of course, lots of people aren't on Twitter, and there aren't really good algorithmic filters associated with this. But I think that there will be in the near future. And I think, consequently, if not Twitter specifically, I think there's a real future in sort of network-based approaches to handling our filtering, to handling filtering based on the people that we trust in our specific subfield and moving really quickly. Particularly, like I said, when we scale that up to be a more algorithmic approach in the same way that Google sort of algorithmically ranks a bunch of pages. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. How do I publish in this world, though? Well, let me give you a quick case study of something I published about the decoupled journal. I submitted this idea I had called the decoupled journal to a Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience. And it's a journal, like really progressive, interesting people running it. But it took forever. I couldn't believe. I said, how am I waiting a year to get this thing published? And I was. It took me a year. I said, this is ridiculous. This field's moving too fast. So I asked them, I said, hey guys, can I just post I wrote this on a Google Doc. So can I just share the Google Doc? Is that okay? And they said, to their credit, sure, go for it. So I did. And I tweeted it out on Twitter. Now I have about, like something like 1,000, 1,500 followers on Twitter. And that's not very many people, right? I mean, out of the whole world, right? Like 1,500 people is a very, very tiny number of people. That's probably, pretty close to all the people in the world, however, who care about what I do, right? That 1,500 people, even though it's a very small number, is for me the most important set of people that I can reach. So when I tweeted this to my followers and they read this, a lot of them found it interesting, thankfully. And so I got all kinds of really good comments on the actual manuscript. I did peer review, right? I'm using my what I do, and they had also, well, you forgot this reference, Jason. You need to build out this point a little bit more. This is a little bit too wordy, And there was really great stuff in there. Instead of having 2 or 3 anonymous peer reviewers, I had probably 10 peer reviewers who weren't anonymous, who I trusted, right? They're in my network. They're people who are credible to me, and who made it a better paper. What's more, it was also a very effective way for me to disseminate this. So I met a guy at a conference who's sort of a big guy in my field, and I was talking to him. I'm a grad student, so I'm kind of like, trying to pitch my work to him. Hey, I'm smart. Pay attention to me, And so I was telling him about the decoupled journal, and he said, oh yeah, no, I read about that. I read about that on your Google Doc. And I thought, wow, did this ever work? This guy is incredibly important in my field. I'm not sure he was even on Twitter at the time, but he knew a person who was, who did follow me. And he was aware of my work, and he thought it was really good, and he was following me closely. And, when it comes time for me to get an academic job or whatever, I mean, it's quite likely that, I'll have either, if I have a collaboration with him or I get a letter of recommendation from him or something like that, that's going to be professionally quite valuable. So we've got this system that's doing so much of what we expect from a journal, right? We've got a peer review coming out of this. We've got the ability to disseminate our work to other people, and we've got the ability indirectly to get rewarded. But there is something missing, right? There's something important missing from the system. If we were to try and run all of scholarship this way, right? Assume everybody suddenly got on Twitter and had all their followers in their specific subfield, we'd be missing something important, and that is, how do we measure it, right? I mean, we need to do things at scale, right? We need to think scientifically if we're going to do that. We need to be able to kind of break this down and measure it, because we're dealing with, millions of scientists here, and we need to be able to try and have a bird's eye view of what we're seeing. So that's where I think this idea of altmetrics comes in. How did we measure things in the past, right? Again, I like to think historically a little bit. Well, mostly it was counting citations, right? So we would sit there and we'd say, well, how many citations do we have? Do we have, this journal has this many per article, then this journal is a good journal. Or maybe a little bit more recently, even if we could say this particular article has this many citations, then it's a good article. However, public citations, they really only tell a part of the story. They don't tell the whole story. And this has actually been known for a really long time. So we have, a great historian of science, Kuhn, saying that if we want to spot emerging research fronts, we're going to have to track both formal and informal communication. Bernal saying quite similar things. I mean, in 1944, right? I mean,
Are you still there, Jason? I think we lost you. At least we lost audio.
All right, I'm going to go and try and...
Yeah,
Hello.
Yeah, you're back. Yeah. We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I am full screen, so unfortunately I can't see the chat screen. I'm not sure how to bring the chat screen up, so I will just wait for you to tell me when you can't hear me anymore. My apologies. All right, so what was the last bit you heard?
Yeah, the slide you're on, and you were talking about starting to talk about the third person there, Garfield.
Ah, terrific. Great, thanks. All right, so sorry about that. So I was talking about Garfield, Eugene Garfield. He sort of invented really the idea of popularized bibliometrics for sure, and he created the Science Citation Index, which is what the impact factor is built on. So really the guy who kind of got his whole citation train rolling. Even he said there's no question. There's useful journals out there that are not cited frequently. And the reason is because they're used by people who don't cite, right? I mean, they're used by clinicians, they're used by practitioners, by educators, by people in industry, right? None of these people are in the citation business, and so while they might find it very useful, they're not citing it, right? So citations, while they're really cool because they're a way that we can track sort of intellectual lineage, they are not sufficient. They don't tell the entire story. So what would telling this entire story look like, right? If we thought about the dimensions of impact, what might we come up with? Well, I suggest we'd come up with at least two dimensions. First of all, as I was saying, we've got different audiences. So we got scholars, and then I'll kind of lump all these other different things in with public, although we could probably be a little bit more subtle than that. But we'll start now, so we'll start easy. So we could say we have scholarly and public audiences. And then we could also say we have different types of engagement. So the easiest, right, so the lightest engagement, we might say, is just a view. Right? Well, I looked at your work. Was it good? Was it bad? Did I do anything with it? Who knows? But I looked at it, right? And then so if we want to move up in engagement, say, well, not only did I view your work, but I also talked about it. You know, I talked with my colleague. It was interesting enough that I thought I wanted to discuss it. If it was even a little bit more interesting, a little more meaningful, I might save it, right? Because I have a limited amount of space to save things. I mean, maybe my hard drive is huge, my brain isn't, and so I don't really save everything that I find. So if I save it, I'd probably think it was at least kind of compelling or something. If I thought even better, I might cite it, right? It's kind of even another level of engagement. Because if I cite it, I'm suggesting I've built on this work. I'm saying that I'm taking some of the credit that might otherwise go to me, and I'm giving it to you. And then finally, in even more engagement would be to actually recommend that particular product. I might say, I'm putting, because the recommendation, you're putting your reputation on the line, right? You're saying, I think this is good. I put my reputation behind it. So that's a pretty serious level of engagement. Now we could sort of put these dimensions into a table like this, right? So we could have sort of the engagement and the audience on different axes. How are we doing right now of sort of understanding the full sort of spectrum of impact? Well, not that well, right? I mean, we really just have one cell covered, and even then, not very well, because there's an N just sitting there all by itself. So we just have scholarly cited. We got that under control. What about everything else? So my suggestion is altmetrics, alternative metrics, these new ways of measuring web-native scholarship could help fill out this table. So with altmetrics, we could actually measure the totality of impact. So when we look at scholarly recommendations, we could be looking at something like Faculty of 1000, which is a biomedical service, which ranks biomedical articles with a group, you have thousands and thousands actually now of relatively eminent scientists who say, this is the article that I think you should read this week. We can look at recommendations to the public by looking at something like, popular press mentions. So, of all the scientific articles published this week, this is the one the New York Times thinks you should know about, right? Kind of recommendation to the public. We could look at citation for scholars because we already have that, but we could also look for citation from the public. Right? If something is cited on Wikipedia, that's actually kind of a big deal. I mean, most of the public gets their information about, let's say, crawfish from Wikipedia. If I want to know about crawfish, I go to Wikipedia and say, tell me about crawfish. And whatever articles about crawfish are cited there, are pretty important to the public's understanding of crawfish, right? So that's sort of a public analog to the scholarly citation. We can look at discussion in scholarly blogs and even on in the tweets of scholars on Twitter, and we can look at discussion on blogs and on the wider Twitter sphere for public discussion. When we want to ask about saving, we can look at Mendeley and Citate, which are online reference managers, kind of like EndNote or RefWorks. Or we could look at Delicious, which is a public bookmarking service. And then finally, if we want to look at Viewed, in some of the research that me and my collaborators have done, we found that that PDF views are more likely, or scholars, sorry, are more likely to read PDFs, while the public is more likely to read HTML. So we can get a little bit of, I mean, it's not perfect distinction, of course, but we can get a little bit of a signal for who's even viewing things by looking at these different download numbers. So my contention then is that bibliometrics, the science of well, I mean, a lot of things, but particularly citation counting for the purposes of this talk. So bibliometrics mines impact on the first scholarly web, right? The web of citations, the web of mentions between different papers, of formal mentions of what Merton called pellets of peer recognition. That was bibliometrics, right? It was this web of ideas that were traced by citations, which is a really cool idea. But Altmetrics mines impact on the next scholarly web. And the next scholarly web is not just a web of intentional citations, like little pebbles that have been placed behind us, right, as we sort of navigate the landscape of ideas. Instead, Altmetrics is more like looking at a fresh fallen field of snow, right, on what was formerly a rocky plain. We had to leave these pebbles behind us so that people could track our ideas. Now all of a sudden there's snow on this plain, and every footprint is leaving a trace. Every conversation, every discussion, every time a person says things or views things, right? I mean, we're rapidly approaching this world where we can have this incredibly textured view of impact. I like Blaise Cohn uses, I think, a wonderful phrase of bibliometric spectroscopy, which is extraordinarily difficult to say, but it's a lovely phrase of describing how we might be able to look at impact and see these sort of spectra, see these lines of influence and compare them. So how do we do this, right? I mean, can we do this today? Well, our goal is that, yes, we should be able to do this today. And for that goal, me and Heather Kovovar have founded a nonprofit startup called ImpactStory. And we're funded by the Sloan Foundation. And it's designed to help people gather and share altmetrics. So I think that I will, because there's a little diceness to the webinar software, I think we'll probably not give a live demo today. But it does work, and so you're welcome to check it out. It's at impactstory.org. And the idea for this is just that you would go and input all of the products you've made, not just your articles, but everything, every web native scholarly product you've made, your software, your data sets, your slide decks, everything. And then it will sort of go out into the web and it will try and find everybody who's ever used it, everybody who's downloaded it, who's tweeted it, who's cited it, whatever sort of use that you have. And you can sort of compile a report based on all of your impacts. So this is an example of one of these reports. And you can see that there's both articles and data sets, and if you were to scroll down, there's a bit more as well. And we sort of put these little badges next to it, and so you get this, like, you know, the blue are for scholars. So you got highly saved by scholars. That means it's in a lot of Mendeley. And if I was live demoing, I could show you this. If you mouse over that, it will show you the percentile. It will say that, you know, you are in the 97th percentile of everybody, everybody indexed in Web of Science in 2009. So compared to your sort of peers, you're saved much more than everybody else, right? And all of these have percentiles associated with them, and I think that's important because otherwise it's hard to know, you know, what these numbers really mean, unless we're comparing them to sort of a baseline. So yeah, so then you can sort of, you can download this as JSON or CSV, so you can do further research on it. So this is an example, I think, of the kind of applications we're going to increasingly see in the future as people realize, you know, this is really useful information. Let's bring it all in one place, let's aggregate it, and eventually let's actually just, let's make it open. Let's put all of that data in one big open pot and let people build awesome algorithms, build awesome applications on top of them that are fueled by compelling algorithms. So why Altmetrics? ultimately, what are we doing? What's the point? And I think one of the key reasons is because impact is more than just bad or good, right? And an impactful scholar is more than just bad or good. I think we need to think a little bit less about scholarship as a 100-meter dash, right? Where there's only one metric, and that's how fast are you. Nothing else matters, right? Realistically, though, scholarship is a lot more textured than it's a lot more multifaceted. Realistically, I think the better analogy for scholarship is more like a football team, right? Where you want people on your football team who are incredibly fast, but you also want people who are incredibly large, or people who are incredibly good at throwing or catching a football, right? You need all different sorts of skill sets on your team, and I think an academic department is quite similar. I think you want people who are extraordinarily good at publishing in Nature and Science. I think you also want good educators. I think you want great methodologists. I think you definitely want people who are really good at communicating to the public the significance of what you're doing. So I think we want to sort of try to start building these teams, and to do that, we want to think multidimensionally. And I think Altmetrics is really good at that because we capture different impacts on different audiences and of different kinds and different levels of engagement. And I think that's the kind of framework that we need to support 21st century decision-making that values web-native science. I tell a quick example of one of those. This team idea was Leo Szilard. And Leo Szilard was a Hungarian physicist that worked in the early days of, I think he worked on the Manhattan Project, and then he worked later on, or I think early on, with a bunch of the physicists who were working in the early stages of nuclear physics. And what was interesting about Leo Szilard is that he did not publish particularly regularly. He wasn't going to knock anybody down with his publication record, right? So he wasn't the 100-meter sprinter. However, every time he left a lab, the productivity of that lab, as measured by papers, dramatically went down. And so a historian, I don't recall who, looked at this and said, well, why is that? And it turned out that he was incredibly good at fixing the machines, right? The physical plant that they used. And he was a physicist, and he wasn't an engineer. But because of his knowledge of the underlying theory, he was really good at being able to fix when the machines would break. And I think this is a wonderful story because it illustrates the importance of having a team, having a person who really understands the experimental apparatus, and a scientist who really doesn't maybe understand the experimental apparatus, but it's great once you give her the data of coming up with a really compelling story and a really compelling paper. I think we need to think about this sort of scientific team, and again, I think Altmetrics is a helpful way of doing that. So my contention is that I think the first revolution has actually, the first revolution that happened, right? That was the sort of journal. But I think that the second revolution has really started. That second revolution, I think, is going to be based on web-native scholarship. Is going to be based on sharing more diverse kinds of scholarship and about filtering in more diverse ways. I think once we have this altmetric data, it's too useful to ignore. Once the data is there, we're going to make these alternative filters and even alternative certification paths based on that data. I like a quote from Peter Winkler, who's a bibliometrician, and he said that the citation graph was like Chekov's gun. Once it was on the stage, it had to be fired, right? I think that Altmetrics is going to be a similar way. Once the data is there, I think it's going to be too compelling not to use. And after all, we know that Chekov was a very wise man. I lost my picture. Chekov, there he is. So I wanted to thank my advisors and people who have funded our research at one time or another. Like I said, we're mostly funded by Alpha Peace Foundation right now, so extra thanks to them. So I've gone through this a little bit quick because I wanted to make sure that we had time for discussion. So what I'd like to do is maybe have a bit of discussion now, and if we run out of questions, I have a couple other things we could talk about as well, if that's okay with the organizers. So, is that all right with y'all?
Yeah, that's fine. So thanks, Jason. There's some virtual applause out here for at the close of your presentation. There is a question from the audience, and this says, I'm interested in sharing information about Altmetrics with my librarian colleagues and faculty in the sciences at my university. What sets ImpactStory apart from other tools to capture altmetric data?
Sure, great question. So I think my screen is still being shared, so we have a little bit of time. I can actually show you the live version. So let me show you a couple other tools that that are used for this. So altmetrics.com is one. And so it's built page. It doesn't really do alternative products. It's mostly for articles. They're just rolling out some support for data sets right now, and it's focused primarily on Twitter, and I think it does a really good job of that. I think it does a better job of that than ImpactStory, at least for now. They're also a commercial product, and so it's all sort of closed source, and the data is closed, which I'm not a really big fan of, but it's a good product overall. They also sort of create this number. I don't know if you can see it right here. So this is like on these donuts have like a 31, 54, 30, and that's based on an algorithm that sort of adds up all the different things. So they look at Mendeley and Twitter and stuff like that, and weights them, and then puts them together and gives them a number. And I think this is exactly the course that we shouldn't be taking. I think this is exactly what we don't want to do, because you become a slave to the algorithm then, right? I mean, it's a proprietary algorithm. The weighting is based on what the person who made the algorithm thinks is important. But you may think something entirely different is important, right? Moreover, depending on the context, different things may be important, right? So if I'm hiring someone for my department, again, and I really need someone who's great at education, I may have a weighting that puts use in syllabi, right? How many of your products have been used in a syllabi? That might, to me, be a really important metric, much more so than your H-index, right? What I think we ought to have instead of a number, I think we actually want to have a slider. I want to have like a mixing panel, right? Like when you mix, songs in a producer booth or whatever. I want to be able to turn up the bass and turn up the treble, right? Turn up the public impact and turn down the scholarly impact, or vice versa, when I'm making decisions. So that's one example. And then there's another one called Plum Analytics. I'm not sure the address, but you can probably Analytics. So Plum Analytics is sort of built to be used by libraries, and it's sort of a tool that you're supposed to be able to kind of use to look at the overall productivity. And so it's a lot more similar in some ways to ImpactStory. You can't really make one individually. It sort of has to be like kind of a library level product. And it's also sort of closed source and closed data. There's no open API. So one of the things that we think is really important for ImpactStory is that we do have this open API, so that if you want to see the underlying data for this collection, you just click this JSON button, and oops, this is my local copy, but it still works. And then you can see all of the data underneath, and you can build your own applications on top of that. In fact, ImpactStory itself is built on its own API. So everything that ImpactStory does, you can access through the API. We think that's kind of important. The other big difference is, like I said, the way that you can create a collection. So if I wanted to create a collection in ImpactStory, I just click on this, and I could put in my ORCID, which is sort of a unique identifier for researchers, to put in my Google Scholar, my article views, everything else, and then I can just hit go and I can get my stuff. So let's say, GitHub, right? I've got open source software at GitHub, and my name is Jason Priem on GitHub. Oops, can't spell my name. So I'm going to import that from GitHub. I'll say, this is my new report, and I'll hit go, and in a second, if the live demo gods are smiling on us, we will have, we'll have the impact report just from my software. And then I can sort of say, okay, highly recommended. So that means 7 GitHub stars is better than 89% of the things on GitHub, this open repository. And I can even zoom in, and I can look at my percentiles. So I can say, how did I get this? Well, I'm getting saved by the public. That's pretty cool. I'm in the 94th, 99th percentile. It's got a confidence interval. If I'm tweeted, what are people saying about this? Right? So let me click through and actually see the tweets. I think that's kind of important. So I click through. Here are the actual tweets that I'm getting, right? And so I can read these, and I can even connect with people. Like, Alberto Pepe, that's interesting. This guy, Fernando Ochea, right? Like, Ocheka, what's his deal, right? Like, let me go check him out and follow him, right? So I can get all these sort of additional discovery metrics from this that I think a lot of the other people aren't doing right now. The biggest difference for us, though, like I said, is delivering this sort of normalization, this sort of percentile ranking, and also being open. We think that you really need to be, if we want to build a sort of next generation of scholarly metrics, I think we really need it to be an open set. In the same way that Google was able to organize the web and become incredibly useful to us because the web is open data, because they can sort of algorithmically organize us and access everything. If we want to do the same thing for scholarship, if we want a Google approach to scholarship, right, where we have everything out there, we can kind of algorithmically filter it in ways much more sophisticated than the simple Twitter feeds I mentioned earlier. If that's what we want, we need to build that on top of open data. And so that's a really important thing for us. So that's a rather long-winded answer to a simple question.
Okay.
Yeah, great question, Judith. I just noticed a question from Judith that people notice things in journals they wouldn't have sought out, but is relevant, right? So we definitely, of course, it's really important, right, that we have a bit of serendipity discovery. And of course, it's not random serendipity, right? It's not like I just go into the library and pick a floor and wander around and poke at a book. Although if you do that, you find awesome things, because I have done that before. But if you want things that are professionally useful, typically you're looking in your professional journals, right? They're sort of related to you. And I think that I know that I find that quite well, with my Twitter feed, for example, because a lot of times people will find just something sort of interesting that isn't specifically focused on their particular subfield of research, but that they think is cool, and so they'll tweet. So I find there's quite a lot of serendipity in my Twitter feed. I think once we move beyond Twitter feeds and we start, like I said, building these really sophisticated algorithms, an algorithm that, the tool that I want, that I think we're going to have eventually in the next probably few years, is so that when I wake up, I go to my computer, I look at my email, drink my coffee, whatever, and I also get an email that says, these are the top 3 things you want to read today. These are the articles that are really important in your field. And that's based on what your network has been saying, based on what your network has been saying and what their networks have been saying and their networks have been saying. We can build a whole recursive graph structure, what they've been saving, what they've been reading, what they've been talking about, put all of those inputs into the hopper, right? Put them all into the machine learning algorithm and turn the crank, and pop, out comes your top 3 articles. In that system, in that algorithm, there needs to be a dial for me that's the serendipity dial, right? And that dial, I can turn it to 0, in which case I'll only get the things that are targeted exactly what I want. But of course, then we get what people have called, where I'm just kind of surrounded by this bubble of what I'm already interested in. Or I can turn the dial up a little bit, right? Turn up to 1 or 2 or 3, and that's when the system just starts randomly kind of taking stuff, right? Pick something that's similar to what I like, but that's not necessarily right in that bubble. And then I guess you could turn it all to 10 and just get like nothing but random, which probably people wouldn't want. So I think that's kind of the key.
Okay, there's a couple more questions. I think Terry Vogel had one in the chat box before Judith. Have you heard from faculty who have included altmetric data in their promotion and tenure materials?
Right, absolutely. Well, that's really the big question, isn't it, Terry? Because until we see that this is something that administrators are interested in, we're not really going to get much traction, and we won't see if administrators are interested in it until we kind of see people trying it. So the short answer to your question is yes, very much yes. So a couple of good examples. I know a guy in Kansas who had a lot of YouTube views on a video that he had done, and so he included that as part of his tenure packet. I know a couple people have used ImpactStory data, not on tenure, but I know one who's planning on using it for his promotion. But I know a few who have used it for funding reports. So they're like, here's my to their funder, sort of need an update of like how the grant is going, and so they've used ImpactStory data to say, here's the way that we're meeting our broader impact part of our grant, because we have this many tweets about our research product and things. I know a really interesting example of Margarita Mooney, who's here at UNC. She submitted a grant. She's a sociologist for a sociology project, $200,000 grant, which is sociology, fairly large grant. And she's an avid blogger, and so she included statistics from her blog, her page views, number of unique visitors, things like that. And the people who gave the grant were very clear to her. They said, a big part of the reason why you got this grant is because of your blog, because we are always on people to disseminate more broadly the results of the research that we fund And we know we're not going to have to do that with you because we know you're already going to do it. You've already got this blog, you're already out there making an impact. So I think there are ample anecdotal reports of people using this for promotion and tenure. There's also anecdotal reports, I think importantly, in the other direction, of funders and tenure committees wanting this, being interested in this. So again, at UNC, we have a draft tenure guideline set that says you should include people's blogs. That should be one of the things you consider when you look at tenure. I've heard of this from a number of other universities. So administrators are very interested in this because, of course, it's very important for them to justify the broader impact of their institution. The NSF recently changed the wording on their grant form. It used to say for the biosketch, in this area write your articles, and now it says in this area write your products, which of course can include web native things like data sets or software. That's a subtle change, but I think it's an important one. I recently gave a talk at the NSF a couple weeks ago, and they were really, really interested in Altmetrics and really interested in how they can use that to better quantify the breadth of the impact that the research they fund is having. So I think there is significant impact from significant interest from the top on these, and when on the top I mean the people who are controlling the purse strings. I think there's a lot of interest from them in these broader impacts, and I think there's also interest from the scientists, particularly those scientists who are making web native scholarship. So I don't think we have any illusions with what we're doing with ImpactStory or what I'm doing with Altmetrics. I don't think we have, what we're doing with Altmetrics, right? Like, I don't think we have any illusions that this is suddenly going to instantly counting tweets is going to create a new era of scholarship. Rather, I think that new era is coming. I think there are huge numbers of scholars today who are making compelling web native scholarship just because they think it's awesome, just because they're excited about a new and more profound way to communicate their science. What we're saying with Altmetrics and with ImpactStory is we've got your back. We want to make it so that those scientists who are pushing things forward, who are pushing us into this second revolution, have ways to get rewarded for what they're doing, or at least ways to make their claim, right, to tell their story more compelling. That's why we have the new ImpactStory, right? So we say scientists are always telling stories about their impact. Let's make those data-driven stories. That's kind of our goal.
Okay, Jason, another question. I should mention the very first question that I asked. I didn't identify the questioner, but that was Linda Galloway. This new question is from Jane Quigley. Hi, Jason. Do you envision that a single dominant tool for Altmetrics will emerge and become the gold standard, as happened with traditional citation metrics? If not, will there continue to be multiple competing tools with different approaches? How will people be able to judge if multiple tools are telling multiple different and possibly contradictory stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. Linda, was it Linda? Was that the name?
Sorry, it was Jane.
Jane, okay, sorry, yeah, Jane. Jane, that's a great question. It's really your question. So I think we've actually already started to see this fragmentation in the citation world. So for a long time, there was only Web of Science, and that was, as you say, the gold standard. And it still is, it's the most important one. But increasingly, Scopus is well recognized, and their numbers are entirely incompatible, right? You can't even add them together because there's sort of overlapping sets. Scopus generally gets more than Web of Science, but it also counts a lot of the same things. And then even beyond that, you have Google Scholar, where in some fields, Google Scholar citations are becoming very significant. I asked one of these guys at the NSF thing actually earlier. I said, when you get an application, a funding application, when you're a reviewer or whatever, what do you look at? And he said, well, I generally just put them in Google Scholar. I see my citations I have in Google Scholar. That's my most important metric. So we have, and again, Google Scholar totally incompatible with Web of Science or Scopus. So we have this sort of fractured landscape with the citation data. And what's really frustrating about that is that all three products are closed. All three products hide the underlying data, which I think is awful. And it makes it really just impossible to combine them together. I mean, I think that's not the future. So what I would like the future to be is one or a few Altmetrics providers that leave the underlying graph open so that they're easy to combine. And so you don't have to necessarily decide which one is the gold standard, because if the underlying data are all there, you can just sort of combine them. That said, there are certainly very significant economies of scale to having there just be one person who's doing that combining, right? If you can just go one place and say, this is the most comprehensive and a completely open place to get Altmetrics, I think that would be of really inestimable value to the community. And so that really is our goal with ImpactStory. Our goal is to say, every metric that you could care about every product from every person is right here, and it's all open. That's our goal. We think that if you have that sort of a database, I think that would quickly become sort of a gold standard, and people could build on top of it. That's a really important goal for us. That's why the open API is there and things. Because if you have that graph, if you have every single product and every single impact, right, and every product is a node in the graph and every impact is an edge, and they're all connected in these ways, then you can build really, really powerful algorithmic builders. So right, in the early days of the web, Google said, y'all are doing it the wrong way, right? Because originally, librarians and other people said, well, let's just, the web is just a bunch of documents. We'll tell people which ones are important. We'll just read them all, and we'll say which ones are good. And then we'll make a little directory of that, right? And that works if there's a couple thousand things on the internet, but it does not work if there's a couple 100 billion things on the internet. It does not work at all. It was later learned. And so Google comes along and says, well, this manual filtering is madness. You can't scale this way. Let's actually use the data to filter the data, right? Let's build boats on top of this data stream. Let's use it for something powerful, for something valuable. And so if you look at this graph, say, well, how many people are linking to you, and how many people are linking to those people, and how many people are linking to those people, it turns out that if you recursively walk this entire graph, you can get extremely useful and trustworthy assessment of value and of relevance to people's searches. And really, the problem of relevance is a filtering problem. And so we can apply the same thing to the scholarly literature if we have all of that graph data open. Smart people much smarter than you will come along, and they'll build really great algorithms on top of this graph data, and they'll be able to give you this really great predictions of what's useful, what's important to you right now. So that's the future that I would like to see for Altmetrics, and part of the reason why I'm doing ImpactStory is because I think that maybe we can be part of that future.
Jason, I have a question for you. This is Dave. In an earlier slide, you threw up like a tweet deck type of presentation or slide and said this was your what your journal looks like, which is basically following different comments, following different search terms, whatever, that gave you the list of published articles, probably in most cases already peer-reviewed in a traditional sense, and that's how you got your information. And then you went through the Altmetrics and ImpactStory presentation, which talked about a lot of different criteria to highlight articles of impact, but it doesn't seem like you're using those metrics yourself to try to point out articles that would be relevant to you, but rather you're relying on human peers to suggest to you the articles that are relevant. Could you comment a little bit on that and how you personally use the ImpactStory measurements to inform your own work?
Good question, and I should have drawn that connection a little bit more clearly in your presentation. I think that right now, we don't have a large enough set of data, and we don't have the algorithmic tools for curating that data to make Altmetrics useful as a global filter for a scholar. I would like us to. I think that would be awesome, and I think that in the next several years we will. I think the steps, though, sort of have to go from, first, let's build the sort of the corpus of data, this really big impact data set that's updated in real time, and then let's build the algorithms on top of that. So what I would like to do is for someone to look at ImpactStory and to look at data from ImpactStory and combine that with data from my network, and then tell me, kind of like I said every day, what is your network talking about? What's important to you based on a range of numeric scores, not just number of tweets, but also number of bookmarks, number of discussions on blogs, number of views or reads, all of these things together, mix them up together with some really cool weighting algorithm that has been validated and tested, and then spit something out. So I think that's going to be the future. I think that's going to replace my manual process of just subscribing to people on Twitter. Because I think that approach, while it is, I think, really cool and really effective, is only a hint of the effectiveness that we could get when we actually start algorithmically reducing those conversations, right? Reducing them down to a few interesting and compelling things. I would say that most of the stuff that I get on my Twitter feed isn't peer-reviewed. Kind of alluding to something I was saying earlier. Most of it isn't peer-reviewed. It's white papers, it's blog posts, conference proceedings, stuff from conferences. And I think that's kind of the advantage, right, is that is my peer review. Those are my peers. Those are people that I trust. And if they think it's useful enough to share, then I'm probably interested enough to look at it. We've done a couple of studies on Twitter where we've asked people, asked scholars, what does it mean to you when something gets tweeted? What does it mean to you when you tweet something? And they've mostly taken it pretty seriously as a sort of professional action for them. So they'll say things like, when I see something on my Twitter stream, it's kind of like a jury has selected that for me, and so I trust it. Or when I do tweet something, I'm very mindful because I don't want to lose my followers, right? Everything's an ego trip for scholars. I don't want to lose my followers, and so I only tweet things that I think people will find compelling and useful. And again, like I said, we're building this world, I think, in which Twitter and maybe similar tools that come along later are reflective of real scholarly impact. Ultimately, these numbers do come from human judgment, though. That's, I think, what's important about Altmetrics is behind it. We are only looking at human judgment. So sometimes people will say, well, how can you quantify impact? How can you put a number on whether something is important? Well, I don't, but people do all the time, right? Every time most conferences these days, right, when you submit to the conference, it's got a little rubric on it. The reviewer says, this is a 4, and this part is a 5, and this part's a 2, or whatever. Well, all we do is quantify impact, right? We do that all the time. What I want to do is be a little bit more rigorous and a little bit more expansive about it. Instead of looking at 1 or 2 reviewers' quantifications of impact, let's look at the entire scholarly ecosystem. Let's look at everybody in my field who knows about this. What have their reactions been all together as a whole? And let's quantify that. A much clearer signal in the same way that Google gives us a much clearer signal on impact than the old school directory ways did. Because instead of a few peer reviewers per web page, which is what they had, we've got the entire power of the whole network behind that judgment. And that turns out to be extremely effective. And I think if it's effective in telling me what the best pizza place is next to me, I think it can definitely be effective in telling me what's the most important scholarship in my field right now, especially if we have access to the conversations of my whole scholarly network.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jason. We've gotten a couple comments thanking you for the presentation, and I'd like to thank you again. I had a couple slides I wanted to put up in closing, but I don't think the screen sharing is coming back to me right now. So I'd just like to acknowledge Jeffrey Mullins and Brian Beasley from ACS for hosting this session today. Tony Williams, who's the chair of the Chemical Information Division, who has been contacting the speakers for these webinars, and thanks again to all who participated. So this meeting has been recorded. It will be posted on the CINF website as soon as we get it ready, and we look forward to your participation in the future. And thanks again, Jason.
Thank you all so much. I love the questions.